There are going to be times when you're going to want to take your parts and assemblies and use them to produce presentation images, whether that's assembly instructions or data for customers or promotional material. Built into Inventor is a rendering environment called Inventor Studio, and when you've got your parts and assemblies to the point where you want to create your graphic images, you launch Inventor Studio by clicking on the Environments tab and Inventor Studio. Once inside Inventor Studio, you've got a whole new set of tools to work with. I'm going to take some time in this video to introduce you to the workflow, and you can follow along. In your own time though, make sure you explore the many possibilities that we don't have time to look at here. Essentially, to create a rendered image, we need to have considered 4 important elements. That's lighting, shadow, reflection, and background image. When we've considered these 4 things and adjusted them to suit our requirements, then we can say we've created our own rendered image. The lighting for the rendered image is taken care of in the Lighting Styles dialog box, and the other 3 elements are taken care of in the Scene Styles dialog box. Let me walk you through the process of creating a rendered image of this front center assembly. If I click on Scene Styles first, up comes the Scene Styles dialog box. You'll see that it has 2 tabs, Background and Environment. In the Background tab that we see by default, we're able to control what's going on in the background of our rendered image. And if I click on the Environment tab, here's where we get control for shadows and reflection. Perhaps the most important thing to do at this stage is to look down the list of preset scene styles and see if there's one that's pretty close to what we're after. If we find one that's close to what we're after, what we're going to do is make a copy of it, rename that and make it active, and then we can set about making changes to the background image of that new scene style and the shadows and the reflections. So let's do that now then. I'm going to click over here and zoom out just to get a better look at the assembly. And I'll click on the forest scene style, and at this stage essentially the only thing I'm taking notice of is where is the reflective plane sitting, which way around is it sitting and where is it. I've already decided that my rendered image is going to have a reflective plane lying horizontally near the bottom of the image, so this reflective plane is vertical and no use to me, so I'll try the next one down. This is no reflective plane, and I'm going to work my way down the list and try that one and that one, and work my way all the way down to the bottom. And I can see from that the only scene styles that have the reflective plane in the correct location and orientation are these 2 here, the XY ground plane and XY reflective. I'm going to select this one as my starting point, but rather than make changes to this default list, I'll right click on that one and say copy scene style, and in the new style name dialog box I can rename that. I'm just going to call it mine and say OK. And what I find is that a new scene style has been added to that list of defaults. And before I go any further, importantly, I'm going to right click on it and make it active. I'm now confident that any changes that I make will be applied to my scene style, and I'll make sure that when I go ahead and render it, it's my own scene style that we're using. So let's go back to the background tab. I will take a few moments to look at the content here. We have 4 buttons in the background tab. If I select this button, I can apply a solid colour to the background. I can see in the preview down here what a solid colour would look like and what the current solid colour is. It's black. If I wanted to change that solid colour in the background, I could click on the colour swatch here. An alternative to a solid colour in the background would be the colour gradient button just beside it. In the preview I can see a gradient from black to white, and that's controlled with these 2 buttons up here. I could change to go from a red to orange, and that's the gradient I would get in the background. Alternatively, I could click on the image button here and I could put a photograph in the background. I'm taken by default to a folder full of background photographs that are provided for you, and I'll select one to see what that looks like in the preview. I could use my own image in the background by navigating with this button here. I'm going to, rather than go for the center option, which leaves a small area at the top and bottom free of the image, I'm going to go for the stretch option, which takes my image and fills completely the area. The last of the 4 options is the image sphere option, which would take an image and curve it. Having looked at all of that, I think I'm going to stick with the colour gradient, and I'll go for black at the top and a grey at the bottom. Having taken all the decisions about the background, then I'm going to click on the Environment tab. And as mentioned earlier, here's where we determine the shadow and reflections present in the rendered image. I can switch the shadows off and on with this checkbox here, off and on, and I can use the slider to go from absolutely black shadows with 100% to no shadow at all, or just a mere hint of shadow, just the faintest shadow at this end. I'm going to sit at about 30% to begin with, and exactly the same applies to reflections. You can turn the reflections on and off with this checkbox here. If you slide up to 100%, you'll get an absolute mirror image as a reflection, and if I slide down to just a couple of percent, I'll get just a hint of reflection. Again, I'm going to leave it somewhere around about 30% for my first couple of attempts. So having taken care of background image, shadows and reflection, I can say save and done to close that dialog box, and I could click on render image, and up comes the render image dialog box. Just before I hit render, I'll point out to you that the render image dialog box is a roll up dialog box, meaning if I come off it, it temporarily rolls away, but I need to just hover over it to bring it back up. By default, I'm going to get a rendered image which is 640 wide by 480 pixels. It would be sensible to keep it really quite small while you're going through the trial and error process. Although with this drop down menu, you'll see there are other larger options. It would make sense to go for the larger options once you're happy with the result. So for now, I'll stick with 640 by 480. It is possible to have preset camera positions, but for now I'm going to make sure that in the camera drop down it says current view, and then the rendered image is going to be governed by the view of the assembly that we get just now. So if I want to see a different part of the assembly, I'll simply use the orbit tool and manoeuvre the assembly around and zoom in and zoom out to suit. I'm happy with that as a position, so I'll go back into the dialog box. I'm going to leave lighting style for now. In the scene style dialog box, if I go to the drop down menu, I can see all the presets that were there originally, and I'm going to make sure that in the window, the scene style that's visible is the one that I set up. I can now say render, and there's the rendered image. It's almost certain that your first attempts at creating a rendered image won't be exactly what you were after, so see this as a trial and error process that you're going to go back into many times until you get it perfect. If and when you get it perfect, you'll click here to save, but for now I'm going to reject that rendered image by closing, and I can go back and make any changes. Here's a really useful tip. If you're not happy with your rendered image, rather than making lots of changes and then rendering again, take a more strategic approach by concentrating on one element at a time. Get the shadows absolutely right, and then move on and get the reflection absolutely right, and then move on and get the background image absolutely right. Take a strategic approach like that, and you're more likely to reach success sooner rather than later. So I'm going to close the render image dialog box just now and go back into scene styles and make some changes. In that rendered image, for example, the reflection was too faint, so I'm going to go to the Environment tab, and I'm going to slide up from 30% to somewhere in the 70s. Say save and done, and I'm going to render again, and having changed nothing except the reflection, I'll say render, and I get a much more noticeable reflection this time. Now that I'm happy with the reflection, I can move on and look at other aspects, for example the background image. I don't think I want to go from black to grey, I think I want to go from mid-grey to a lighter grey, so I'll close that, go back to scene styles, and in the background image I'll change the black to a mid-grey, and OK. And the bottom colour, I think I want to go even lighter than that lightest grey, so I'll define a custom colour like so. I'll OK that. Save and done. And if I render again and change nothing else, that's the result I get. I'm not particularly happy with the size or the orientation of the part there, so I'll close the dialog box, close the render image dialog box, and I'll manoeuvre this around with the orbit tool, and we'll zoom in a fraction to get a larger image. Render again, and that's an improvement. And the final thing to talk about is lighting styles. I'll close this dialog box and point out to you that in the render image dialog box there are lighting styles available, and in the drop down menu you'll see that there's a high number of preset lighting styles. By default it says current lighting. If I scroll down the list I can pick blue hue lighting, the next one in the list, and you'll see the lighting theme change. I'll go back in and pick the next one down, and if I use the cursor keys I can run down the whole list and select a lighting style that gives me what I want. For the purposes of this demonstration I'm going to stick to just using one of the lighting styles from the default list. I think I'll go with that one. But in the same way that you made your own scene style, you could tweak one of the presets and create your own lighting style. I'll stick with pleasant and say render, and that's another effect again. There's a huge number of options available then to you in Inventor Studio. On the one hand that opens up many opportunities, but on the other you have to be careful about taking a strategic approach, or you could easily use up a lot of time going round in circles. Once you're comfortable with the workflow shown here, take some time to explore the other features.